Well, it looks like U.S. foreign policy is trickling down to U.S. corporate policy. A group of Iranians are accusing Apple of racial profiling. This after news broke out in a small town outside of Atlanta that an Apple representative refused to sell an iPad to a young woman because she was Iranian. Here's the local news coverage in Atlanta.
I'm from Iran, he said. I just can't sell this to you. Our countries have bad relations.
I would say if you're trying to buy an iPhone, don't tell them anything about Iran.
Zach Jafarzadeh had a similar experience at the Apple store in Perimeter Mall. He was helping a friend buy an iPhone. That friend was from Iran, living and studying here on a visa.
We never talked about him going back to Iran or something like that. I mean, he was just speaking.
Well, that story sparked outrage by Havar, a recently formed group of Iranians and Iranian Americans. They say they're anti-war, an anti-sanction group, and they took their message outside an Apple store in New York City.
Mic check! Mic check! Mic check! Mic check! We are from Iran! We are from Iran! We are from Iran! We are from Iran! Apple, stop profiling! Apple, stop profiling!
To talk more about the greater implications of this, Bita Mostofi, an organizer for Hazar, joins us now. Welcome to the show, Bita. So first, I want to get your initial reaction to this incident.
You know, our initial response was that as a group that opposes sanctions and also state repression inside of Iran, we saw this as an example of how sanctions, the way that they read, are so broad that a company like Apple can, in effect, create a chilling effect on all things Iranian. Not allowing an Iranian individual, because they speak Farsi, to purchase an iPad or an iPhone is just emblematic on the reading of sanctions law, trickling down to the point where you have a violation of U.S. federal civil rights law.
Now, this happened outside of Atlanta. Is this an isolated case, or to your knowledge, has it happened anywhere else?
There were recent reports by the National Iranian American Council that there have been reports of other incidents also in California and I believe Virginia. So it isn't seen as an isolated incident at all. And in fact, stepping outside of the United States, I know through friends and contacts that I have in the Netherlands that, as we know, the EU sanctions are going to go into effect, the oil embargo July 1st. And already there, the interpretation of those sanctions have led to suspension of visas for Iranian students studying in the Netherlands.
And so I know that your group is anti-sanction, and sanctions ultimately, they're put in place to achieve these foreign policy goals, to affect the regime or to target the regime. But would you say that in reality they affect ordinary Iranians?
Absolutely. I mean, my background is I'm an individual that actually opposed sanctions against Iraq, and I traveled to Iraq before the invasion in 2002 and saw the devastation and the toll that this policy had on the country. And what we've seen in Iran is an escalation of sanctions over the last 4 years, really, that in rhetoric of countries of the P5, the US, the UK, France, Russia, China, and Germany, the P5+1, has been to target and curtail Iran's nuclear program. But in effect, sanctions history has shown that what really happens is an economy gets devastated, and the people who bear the brunt of that are those who are already bearing the brunt of repression from their own government, like Iraqis in Iraq and now Iranians in Iran.
And what's kind of ironic about this particular case is that they were trying to purchase an iPad, and this is something, you know, iPhones, iPad, these devices can be used to empower people. You know, presumably you can access Twitter, Facebook, social media, and you know, in the Arab Spring we saw how this kind of technology was used to help spread awareness and spark this movement. But in this case, the Iranians are being deprived of using this technology.
That's right, Liz. And the thing is that the U.S. government has, in recent years, taken a step back and eased sanctions on certain software. But the problem, again, is that the sanctions read so broadly that companies like Apple, like Yahoo and Google can take an interpretation quite easily away from this, that they become weary of any sort of access to software or hardware that they might have to Iranians, or in this case, an Iranian American, for fear of what might happen to them, what sort of sanction they might receive in return. But you're right. I mean, even in Iran, what we saw in the aftermath of the disputed 2009 elections was that the U.S. government taunted Iranians. You know, Senator Clinton, or I'm sorry, Secretary of State Clinton was even heard at the time as calling it a Twitter revolution inside of Iran. But it seems ironic and rather hypocritical that at the same point in time, what we have are policies that make it more and more difficult for young activists, young organizers inside of Iran, and people just wanting to communicate with each other to have the access to the tools that they need to do that. And Iran, I want to say very clearly, has a media that is completely state-run. So people's access to information and the sharing of information is almost entirely through internet sources.
Would you go as far as to say this incident and incidents like it, would you describe it as racial profiling? Would you go as far as to describe it as that?
Absolutely. I mean, let's look at what Apple did very specifically. And if what they did, which is what was reported, was stop an individual who was speaking a foreign language, in this case Farsi, and say simply because they spoke that language that they were going to deny a sale, then that is clearly racial profiling, because in effect their policy reads that sanctioned countries are the countries in which they can export certain goods. And those countries include Cuba, they include North Korea, they include Syria and the Sudan. So what Apple, in essence, should be doing then is literally stopping anybody that they hear speaking Spanish, anybody that they hear speaking Korean, anybody that they hear speaking Arabic, and then denying them a sale if it's not just racial profiling.
Okay. Beata, tell me a little bit more about this group, Havar, that you're an organizer for, what you stand for, and I know you were protesting over there in New York. Ultimately, what is the message that you want to get out?
You know, we formed as a way for Iranians, Iranian Americans, and other allies who stand against a potential war on Iran, against sanctions, and in solidarity with Iranians struggling against state repression. And the reason that we did that is often it's a double-edged sword. You know, on the one hand, you have a policy like sanctions that we do believe and have historically shown to be a collective punishment against a country, and pave the way for a possible invasion that we vehemently oppose. And on the other, you have a regime inside of Iran that is extremely repressive, that you know, has the highest rate of execution in the world, that has cracked down on any kind of resistance in the country. And what we wanted to show was that we actually stand with the people, that regardless of what government is wielding the tools of repression, that we oppose that repression wholeheartedly, whether it's coming from the Iranian government or the U.S. government or anybody in the Security Council, be it France, Russia, China, the UK. We oppose that repression, and we want to fight for policies that don't have the heavy brunt and the collective punishment on ordinary people the way that the policies that we've seen now do.
All right, Beata, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your experience with us. That was Beata Mostafi, an organizer for Hazar.
Thanks for having me.